We have a very interesting hearing on the Western Hemisphere, an area that we don't spend nearly enough attention to, primarily because there's so much else going on in the world, but we obviously need to do that. And we want to welcome, we have a number of students, it looks like to me. I don't know if we have a group here from somewhere. It's a different kind of crowd than we usually get. And I usually give a speech about you can't disrupt the hearing or you get arrested and thrown out and banned for a year, but I'm not going to give that speech because it looks to me like a very orderly crowd. So thank you. You're welcome here, and we're glad to have you and glad to have you watch these proceedings. We have a couple of very good witnesses today, that one chosen by the Republicans, one chosen by the Democrats, who will give us some insight into what's going on in Latin America. And I'm going to start by making an opening statement. I'm then going to yield to the distinguished ranking member to make an opening statement. And after that, we will hear from our witnesses. And after that, we'll open it up to questions from the committee. So with that, in 1823, President Monroe asserted the right and interest of the United States to oppose foreign powers meddling with the emerging independent nations in the Western Hemisphere. Monroe's vision was an America that protects the Western Hemisphere from foreign domination. Of course, Monroe lived in a different era, before world wars, before an increasingly global economy, even, of course, before airplanes and any other rapid transportation. But his point is still relevant today. Prioritizing America's national security interests means prioritizing stable and prosperous Western Hemisphere, because America has adversaries who look to undermine our interests and our security by interfering in the affairs of our closest neighbors. As our enemies and competitors like Russia, China, and Iran expand their footprint in our hemisphere, we need to strengthen security and economic cooperation with our democratic neighbors to protect our interests. It was interesting to hear yesterday on our panel the people that were up for the ambassadorships focusing on the importance of economic cooperation and bringing that back into the equation, which has gotten a little lost, again, because there's so many other problems. The most pressing long-term threat in the Western Hemisphere is China. It has displaced the United States as the top trading partner for almost every country in South America. Across Latin America, China is extracting valuable critical minerals, building strategic ports, and deepening military cooperation. China remains the single greatest supplier of fentanyl to Mexican cartels. It is illegal for Chinese companies to sell these chemicals in China, but the Chinese government permits the same companies to send chemicals to Mexico for production of fentanyl. The production of these opioids and the cartels who shuttle them across our border are killing over 100,000 Americans every year. That's a staggering number, particularly when you put it on a daily and weekly basis. Further south, China is meddling in the Panama Canal as it seeks to control the shipping companies that move the cargo through it. President Trump is right to focus on China's involvement in this critical infrastructure that we spent so much treasure and blood constructing. The fact of the matter is China has and will use footholds in Latin America to threaten the U.S. We must counter their presence today to ensure it isn't a vulnerability tomorrow. Beyond China, Iran has expanded its reach into our hemisphere. Iran warships have docked in Brazil, and Iranian proxies have built networks across Latin America. Meanwhile, Russia meddles in the region, conducting information operations and deploying troops, military aircraft, and naval vessels to Cuba and Nicaragua. Chinese money supports the governments in Cuba and Venezuela, and Russian personnel ensure they stay in power. We can't allow these authoritarian expansions of influence so close to home. While we need to push back, we also need to protect Americans by securing our border. President Trump and his team are working aggressively at this, as we all know, and I strongly support his efforts. Monroe had the right idea. Let's prioritize solving the problems right in front of us and redouble our efforts to protect American national security by making sure our hemisphere is stable. I look forward to hearing from our witnesses on how we can do that, and will now turn to my friend, distinguished ranking member, Senator Shaheen.
Thank you very much, Chairman Risch. Before I get to my opening statement, I just wanted to make a couple of announcements. One is I brought up these maps of Latin America, and Senator Kaine will recognize them because we saw them in the Armed Services Committee, and they're actually a couple of years old, but I think they speak to the challenges that we have in Latin America. As you can see, the map, the far map, shows the PRC's regional presence and activities, and you can see by how much of Latin America is colored in a dark crimson, the influence that China has. And so anybody who wants to come up and look at some of the detail after the hearing will find it very interesting. The other map is Russia's influence in Latin America. Again, you can see from the orangey red the extent to which Russia is influencing Latin America. And as I said, while these maps are a couple of years old, I think they speak to the challenge that we have in Latin America, which I'm sure we will hear from our witnesses. So thank you both for being here. I also wanted to just announce, I'm sure that most members have seen it, but because so much of the last couple of hearings has focused on what's happening with USAID and the programs and services of foreign assistance, the Supreme Court today sided with restoring the funding for those programs. So if folks have not seen that decision, it's probably worth all of us looking at. So now to get to my official remarks. After President Trump's tariffs on Canada and Mexico and his address to Congress last night, I think the question of how the United States approaches the Western Hemisphere is more important than ever. This region offers incredible opportunity for the United States, as the chairman has said. It's home to one of our largest trading partners in the world, Mexico. That trading relationship amounted to about $800 billion recently. Latin America also includes some of our closest allies. Colombia became a NATO partner country in 2017, for example. But whether it's the 25% tariffs that will affect American businesses and consumers, or threats against Panama, these actions undermine trust in the United States and push away our allies when we need them. Curbing immigration to our southern border and fighting drug cartels, stopping the flow of illegal weapons and fentanyl, all of those are critical issues, and we want countries like Mexico and Canada to help us tackle these challenges. But undermining trust in the United States gives our adversaries, like China and Russia, more of an opening across the hemisphere. Even before the tariff threats, trade with China was surging across Latin America. According to the World Economic Forum, China's trade with Latin American countries could reach more than $700 billion in the next decade. At the same time, Vladimir Putin's propaganda machine has flooded Latin America. According to the University of Oxford, the Spanish-language version of the program, Russia Today, is Putin's most successful, more than RT in English, Arabic, German, or French. Not only is Putin trying to undermine democratically elected governments in the region with disinformation, but Russia's spy services have also been expanding their footprint. As former CIA Director Bill Burns explained, and I'm quoting, "Part of this is a function of the fact that so many Russian intelligence officers have been kicked out of Europe. In the face of these challenges, it's deeply concerning that the administration has frozen foreign aid and attacked the United States Agency for International Development." And as I said, hopefully those issues are going to be worked out. These programs stabilized societies. They gave people in places like Colombia or Haiti incentives to stay home and to not migrate to our borders. They supported women struggling with gender-based violence in places confronting a wave of femicides. As one UN report put it, at least 11 women were murdered every day for gender-related reasons in Latin America and the Caribbean. The foreign aid freeze has also thrown counter-narcotics programs from Guatemala to Mexico into chaos. One program with the United Nations had been scanning for contraband and fentanyl chemicals at Mexican ports, and that work has stalled. Cuts to USAID and the Inter-American Foundation also make it harder for the United States to compete with China's Belt and Road infrastructure initiatives. Deepwater ports, rail lines, solar energy plants, these are the kinds of projects that increase China's influence in the region. So, Dr. Myers, Dr. Ledford, I appreciate you both coming to testify before us today, and I think my basic question to both of you is, how do we keep from giving China and Russia complete free rein in this atmosphere? I'm sorry, in this hemisphere. How does all of what we're doing make America safer, more secure, and more prosperous? In the long term, it's in our interest to ensure that we have close relationships and growing ties in the Western Hemisphere. So I look forward to hearing your thoughts. Thank you both. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator. We'll now hear from our witnesses. We're going to start with Dr. Ledford. Dr. Ledford is a Hoover Fellow and Assistant Director of the Hoover History Lab at the Hoover Institution. His work focuses on the exercise of American power abroad, particularly in the Western Hemisphere, obviously in our wheelhouse today. So, Dr. Ledford, we're glad you're here. I'd like to hear from you.
Chairman Risch, Ranking Member Shaheen, and distinguished members of the committee, thank you for this invitation to testify before you on this critical matter. The views I express today are mine and not the Hoover Institution nor Stanford University. The Western Hemisphere is foundational to American national security. As the late great Secretary of State George Shultz often said, foreign policy starts in your own neighborhood. Indeed, throughout our nation's history, policymakers understood this guiding principle of statecraft. If the Western Hemisphere is without security, the United States cannot continue to support its allies while confronting its adversaries. To ensure regional stability, preventing hostile foreign powers from spreading their malign influence in the Western Hemisphere must serve as the cornerstone of American foreign policy. It has in the past, and it should guide national security strategy today. To be sure, the defensive principles enshrined in the Monroe Doctrine have functioned as the enduring bipartisan consensus until recently. During the first quarter of the 21st century, the United States gradually became estranged from its neighbors, and America's enemies noticed the neglect. Strategic competition has come to our neighborhood. In America's absence, China has moved into the Western Hemisphere to spread its economic, military, and political influence deep and wide, complemented by the footprints of its despotic partners, Iran, Russia, and North Korea. You could have two more maps up here to my left. Chinese trade has soared in Latin America and the Caribbean. China is the region's second largest trading partner and South America's largest. Billions in investment have targeted the sectors of energy, mining, manufacturing, infrastructure, and technology. Take, for instance, Huawei's market share, or the megaport that just opened in Peru, majority owned by a Chinese military company, or the encroachment on the Panama Canal by Chinese state enterprises. The potential ramifications of such dual-use infrastructure should alarm every American. Beyond economics, Chinese military and intelligence presence grows, from spy stations in Cuba to arms sales and military training programs to surveillance technology exports to authoritarian regimes in Cuba, Nicaragua, and Venezuela. Compounding these challenges, transnational criminal organizations wreak havoc from South America to Canada. Drug cartels present an intractable threat to the American homeland. Their enterprises drive the opioid crisis that devastates our communities and kills 200 Americans every day. China contributes to this crisis by not only supplying the precursor chemicals and the pill press equipment needed to produce fentanyl, but also the money laundering services to wash the ill-gotten gains. With all these problems, Americans may ask, what are we doing to advance our interests in the Western Hemisphere? Well, Congress has led the way with bipartisan resolve, especially on this committee. Exemplified by the Western Hemisphere Partnership Act enacted in December, this landmark legislation mandates a comprehensive 5-year strategy due by June to promote security, prosperity, and the rule of law. It provides an overarching framework to address the very issues that we discussed today. At the outset of President Trump's second term, the United States appears now to be pursuing an America's first approach. The administration aims to eliminate drug cartels, roll back Chinese malign influence in the region, and deepen our partnerships with the Americas to bring about security and prosperity. These efforts signal a nascent strategic reorientation, but more must be done. And I believe it can be accomplished with bipartisanship and through cooperation between Congress and the White House. In closing, I'll offer a few high-level recommendations, though of course they're easier said than done. America must develop a 21st century framework for hemispheric defense and development To do so, the United States must craft a realistic and attainable 5-year strategy as mandated by legislation. It must include the ways and means for America to secure binding and sustainable long-term economic agreements to further regional integration. It must also include revitalized security measures that address these acute challenges of the 21st century. The United States must compel China to end its involvement in the fentanyl crisis. The United States must seek a workable security framework with Mexico. The United States must exercise leadership to resolve the crisis in Haiti. The United States must continue to isolate, pressure, and encourage democracy in Cuba, Nicaragua, and Venezuela. The United States must consistently engage its neighbors. Here, the President must nominate high-quality diplomats to serve, and Congress must expedite their nominations or confirmations. And lastly, Congress must continue working on the Western Hemisphere in a bipartisan manner. This sends the strongest signal to America's enemies. Of course, what I've just laid out is easier said than done, but I'm an optimist. With that, I yield, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you very much. Now we'll hear from Ms. Myers. Margaret Myers is a senior advisor at the Inter-American Dialogue and the United States Institute of Peace and a global fellow at the Woodrow Wilson Center. Ms. Myers also serves in the faculties of Georgetown University and the Johns Hopkins School of Advanced International Studies, and previously worked as Latin America and China analyst for the U.S. Department of Defense. Ms. Myers, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, and good morning. I'd especially like to thank Senator Risch, Ranking Member Shaheen, and the distinguished members of the committee for the opportunity to testify today. Hemispheric developments and U.S. national interests are deeply intertwined. Shared borders, interpersonal ties, economic interests, and security alliances have bound the nations and people of our hemisphere for much of our recent history. We derive tremendous economic and other benefit from these ties. At the same time, developments in the hemisphere present some challenges to U.S. interests. Political shifts, violence, natural disasters, and other difficulties have exacerbated irregular migration, an issue that has tested the United States across administrations and overshadowed much of our substantive engagement. Other critical issues for the United States include transnational crime, including the trafficking of illegal goods and substances, such as fentanyl, which has had a dramatic wasting effect on the U.S. population. As someone who has followed China's engagement with the region for upwards of 2 decades now, I am also concerned about the progress that China, and Russia for that matter, have made toward dismantling U.S. ties in the region, whether through targeted messaging campaigns, disinformation campaigns, political alliances, or because of now extensive economic footprint in the hemisphere that China maintains. Fortunately, there is much that the United States can do to maintain and grow its partnerships in the region, to address shared security and other challenges, and also to compete effectively with China and other extra-regional actors. But doing so begins with a commitment to constructive engagement, carefully employing the widest range of economic and diplomatic tools and platforms, including new, innovative mechanisms to bolster American competitiveness. In this sense, the Supreme Court decision is quite heartening. Engagement through the many U.S. and multilateral organizations that provide economic and other forms of assistance to the region should be an indispensable part of any effort to advance American interest in the Western Hemisphere. In fact, only by forging constructive partnerships with the region can we hope to address the full range of challenges and opportunities inherent in the Western Hemisphere-U.S. relationship. Forceful measures will generate immediate effects, but only for so long. Reliance on sticks alone is not sustainable and will not yield desirable long-term outcomes, whether for the U.S. or our partners. The United States is not the only viable economic or political partner for Latin American nations. Unless we recognize the strategic value of our hemispheric relations and demonstrate that we have something substantial to offer, including in the form of investment and development assistance, Latin American nations will increasingly turn toward China or other actors. With this in mind, we must pursue our many national economic security objectives in ways that support and reinforce our soft power and economic stability and not undermine them. Our foreign assistance, security cooperation, and diversified economic engagement have historically distinguished us from China. If we hope to make the case that we are a more reliable, trustworthy, and steadfast partner, then we must demonstrate that to the region. Equally, failing to invest meaningfully in our relationships with Latin America will exacerbate the challenges we face. Finally, if we are serious about competing with China, this is a definitive moment. China continues to engage across the region, bringing wide-ranging diplomatic and economic tools to bear in support of its interests. Recently, it has aggressively entered into the venture capital ecosystem in Latin America, focusing on technology startups, including fintech and AI-enabled companies. If this sounds familiar, it's because we've seen the same playbook in strategic infrastructure, critical minerals, and ICT. The good news, again, is that there is considerable opportunity for the United States to be a significant player across many different sectors in Latin America, while also furthering regional integration and challenging China in the process. For instance, through the Development Finance Corporation, the U.S. government has the capabilities to leverage trusted and knowledgeable institutional partners, like the Inter-American Development Bank, to present solutions to U.S. national security challenges with relatively small investment. At the same time, preserving our existing strengths, our partnerships, programming, and relatedly trust in our country is fundamental. It is very likely that we will look back on this moment as a definitive one in our hemispheric relations and a possible inflection point in China's global affairs. This is not a time to sacrifice our hard-won gains and partnerships. It is a moment to think critically and carefully about what constitutes power, what we stand for, and how we can creatively and constructively achieve that. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you. We're going to do a round of 5-minute questions and then have a second round if there's interest in doing that. And so I want to start with a basic question for both of you, and that is that I think most Americans would be shocked to hear that now on this map, China has replaced the United States as being the trade partner that is first. And it's surprising, it's shocking in a lot of respects. And admittedly, the Chinese is a communist government, and they obviously, the government actually owns, controls, and deploys the capital. In a capitalist system like ours, it's the private sector that does that. Well, the private sector only goes and invests and puts their money where there's going to be a profit. Communist countries don't have that same restriction. They go and spend money, and we see it over and over again with the Chinese. They will underbid our people. They'll pay money under the table. They'll do all kinds of things to replace the United States as a purveyor of goods or services or whatever it is. And that's what's causing this, is they have the ability to do this, whereas a capitalist system doesn't. And so that's a real challenge for us, because we don't do it. We will never do it. It's just not in our DNA to do that. And we've become the most successful country in the history of the world by doing the things we do in a free market and a capitalist way. So how do you overcome that in a situation like this? Because look, these countries are going to go, when it's particularly a country that is destitute or close to it. If there's money on the table, they're going to take it. They don't care whether the devil himself puts it there or the Chinese Communist Party. They're going to take it and do the kinds of things they need to do to get their hands on it. So, Doctor, why don't we start with you and give us your thoughts on that line of thinking.
Thank you, Senator. It's a great question, and one that policymakers have been grappling with for decades, or at least the last decade. I think there are ways that we can leverage our institutions for public-private partnerships, whether it's the DFC or new programs, and some ideas that have been generated in Congress about creating a development fund that leverages private equity to invest in critical infrastructure in Latin America and provide terms and remove barriers to do so. In regards to the DFC, Congress shouldn't have to sign off on every loan that's over $10 million. We should remove those barriers. There have to be national security waivers for every country but 4. Let's remove those barriers. And let's catalyze our powerful capital inside the United States with the backing of the government to invest in these industries. We just have to provide the alternative. And without providing it and without leveraging our strengths in the United States, the Chinese Communist Party will just continue to fill the void. Thank you.
Ms. Myers?
Thank you. This is sort of the critical question, right, for us in terms of our ability to compete with China effectively across sectors in the Latin American region. The first point I would make is that we are at something of a shifting moment in the China-Latin America dynamic, in which Latin America is looking at China a bit differently, right? More seriously, contemplating much more seriously both the benefits and especially the drawbacks of engagement with China. Many decades now of experience dealing with China, of projects gone wrong, of complicated debt obligations, have changed somewhat the tenor of the relationship over time. In addition to this, there are now concerns about what China can even bring to bear as it struggles with its own economic development. A lot of what the region is expecting will not come to pass, even though China continues to engage in serious and important ways across the region. So for me, this really is a period of strategic opportunity for the U.S. to engage more extensively through messaging, through collaboration with our partners, right? But also to begin to engage through creative mechanisms in various forms. A lot of the work that's already being done to even the playing field, right? To work on institutional capacity, to work on the possibility of bringing in investment review mechanisms, right? In countries, and there is some receptivity to that, is really quite critical. State Department, Commerce, many others are working very hard to make this happen, and I hope they will continue to be able to do so. In other cases, I agree. I agree entirely that we need to pursue some new creative mechanisms and, collaborative capital models of the sort that were described. Crowding in venture capital, crowding in institutional capital is a terrific mechanism through which to do this. This can be DFC-led, incorporating a national security lens, but crowding in institutions and resources from institutions such as the Inter-American Development Bank, which are critical partners for the United States, and which pursue programming that is overwhelmingly in the interest of the United States. So both our current trajectory, understanding right where things stand in the China-Latin America dynamic, and moving forward with creative solutions would seem to me a good strategy.
Well, appreciate both your thoughts on that. I think everybody on this committee meets regularly with heads of state and on down from other countries. And the thing that always strikes me is we are the partner of choice. They want to do business with America. Having said that, like I said, if the Chinese come along with free money or what have you, and we've all seen what's happened in the ports where they build a port, loan them the money, and it turns out to be a predatory loan, and Chinese wind up with a port. These stories have gone around the world, and people understand that. They like dealing with us because of the fact that we have a rule of law, and that is the biggest strength that we have is the rule of law. It also is a weakness because we have laws that prohibit paying money from under the table. In certain third world countries, that's the only way you get a contract, is by paying the government official who's making the decision under the table. And it is, again, Americans don't have a real idea of how ubiquitous this is around the world, and that includes Latin America as well as other continents. So this is something that hopefully we continue to gain on, and I think we are making gain on it. It's what I call reputational business, and they want to do business with us because we have the reputation. But we'll have to see as time goes on whether that carries the day or not. Senator Shaheen.
Well, thank you. And just to follow up on that a little bit, 2 years ago, I joined Senator Cornyn and a congressional delegation to Latin America. We visited 4 countries, Panama, Colombia, Argentina, and Brazil. And I think, Senator Cornyn, it's fair to say that everywhere we went, what we heard from officials is they would like to have a trade agreement with the United States. And it seems to me that that's a tool that we have ignored as we've looked at those opportunities for investment in Latin America. And so could both of you speak to the importance of trade agreements and what we should be thinking about and why that would be helpful for us to look at those as opportunities for American investment in Latin America? And I'll ask you to start, Ms. Myers.
Certainly. Thank you, Senator. Yes, I mean, as we know, and as was mentioned in the opening remarks, China's trade engagement with Latin America is expansive, especially in South America. It's the top trade partner for most of the countries in the region at this juncture. And those very trade dynamics are contribute extensively to its influence in the region. When you are exporting almost all of your goods, right, or the major commodities to China, you think twice before rocking the boat or challenging China on wide-ranging policy issues. And so, with that in mind, it is critical, both from an economic perspective, certainly, but also in terms of our interests in pursuing certain policy agendas and political areas of political cooperation, that the U.S. also engage in trade, grow trade where possible. We have been in something of a stasis on this for a number of years now, and there are efforts underway to try to think creatively about how these partnerships can be expanded, including through the Americas Act, for example, and through other mechanisms that fall somewhat short of a free trade agreement. But without these trade dynamics, even expanded investment is not going to fundamentally alter the power dynamics at play in the region when China is indeed the top trade partner for so many countries in the region, and that dependency dynamic is there and has profound effects on decision making. So I think absolutely this is a priority. To whatever extent possible, it's one that needs to be advanced.
Thank you, Dr. Ledford. Do you agree with that?
Yes, we should pursue free trade agreements. In fact, I think we could secure one with Argentina right now. They're certainly seeking one. We should also revisit the agreements we currently have. DR-CAFTA, Nicaragua should not be in DR-CAFTA, and I know the administration is looking seriously at removing Nicaragua from DR-CAFTA. I know the other member countries are also seriously considering backing that, so that's something that everyone should pay attention to and certainly encourage the administration to pursue if possible. Long-term secure binding agreements is a step forward. We're not going to change the balance in the trade dynamics in Latin America vis-a-vis China in the near term, but if we don't do anything, we will just continue to lose economic ground in our own hemisphere. Thank you.
Well, and staying with you, Dr. Ledford, you noted in your essay last year, America's First, Reorienting U.S. Foreign Policy, that Russia sought to exert anti-American influence throughout Latin America and the Caribbean. And they've done that through a range of things. Launching propaganda about Russia's war in Ukraine has been one of those. So are you continuing to be concerned about Russia's malign influence in the hemisphere, and what steps can we take to counter that influence? As we're thinking about the war in Ukraine, is there anything that we think is relevant to what's happening now in terms of peace negotiations that those Latin American countries can be helpful with?
Yes, I'm very concerned about Russian malign influence in the Western Hemisphere. I think first and foremost, we can continue to isolate the countries they're most closely associated with, Venezuela, for example, and Cuba. It's as far as the effect from the Ukraine war, I'm not prepared to comment on that. I don't know enough about any sort of Latin American influence on that. Although I will say that Russia uses economic coercion to further its aims. It has pressured Latin American countries not to support Ukraine in its defense against Russian aggression, Ecuador being the most striking case in which Vladimir Putin refused to buy bananas because Ecuador was going to ship old weapons in exchange for new weapons with the United States. So it actually prevented the United States from combating gangs that are destabilizing Ecuador.
Thank you. I just want to, I'm over my time, but I just want to follow up really quickly because last week the United States sided with Russia in a resolution before the UN condemning Russia's invasion in Ukraine. And we sided with countries like North Korea and Nicaragua, some of those countries that are adversaries with respect to most issues that we're working on. What kind of message does that send to the other countries in Latin America?
Well, I'm not in the administration. I'm not privy to the conversations that went on behind the decision to do that. I would recommend in general that the United States not side with our adversaries in the Western Hemisphere, but occasionally there are trade-offs in the pursuit of larger goals, such as peace negotiations.
Ms. Myers, did you have anything to add to that?
In terms of the signal it sends to to our partners in the region. I think it's deeply concerning. It has sowed tremendous confusion. Certainly is a departure from U.S. foreign policy objectives and U.S. foreign policy messaging and interest over many years and decades, and in many cases, I think, undermines the extensive and effective work that we've been doing to challenge the influence not just of China, but of Russia, right, and many other actors in the region to date. Will this be taken seriously looking ahead? Will we find partnerships on these issues? Will we pursue partnerships on these issues? All of these are critical questions, and so I think it's sowed tremendous confusion and reduced somewhat trust in our foreign policy.
Thank you.
Senator Corner.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. If you don't mind, I'd like to give you a homework assignment. So back in 1823, the Monroe Doctrine was announced the official policy of the United States government with regard to the Western Hemisphere and the activities of other countries in the region. Obviously, that's evolved over many, many years, but I would like for you to tell us what do you think, instead of the Monroe Doctrine, what the Trump Doctrine should be for the Western Hemisphere. And maybe with the students here, maybe they can come up with some ideas as well. That would be, I think, a useful exercise. So BlackRock just purchased 2 ports in and around Panama from a Hong Kong company, which obviously is a front for the Chinese government and their activities in the area. I think you alluded to this a little bit, Dr. Ledford, but how can we access the capital markets? How can Congress encourage U.S. capital markets, which are a tremendous source of strength for the country? We don't have a lot of money to spend because we are looking at $36 trillion plus in debt. But if we can access our capital markets to encourage purchasing of facilities in Central and South America by the United States or our friends, seems to me that would be a good idea. And maybe Senator McCormick, having come from maybe a little bit of that background, has some ideas as well. But if you could tell us what can we do to encourage more of that?
Thank you, Senator. It's an excellent question. I think Congress has developed some workable ideas. The conceptual framework behind the Americas Act, I think there's much Congress could do to incentivize a program through the Commerce Department to work on catalyzing the private capital to purchase the facilities that we're discussing. And I certainly would encourage all of you to look at that.
One of the things that on our trip that Senator Shaheen mentioned a couple of years ago that we heard from Southern Command, General Laura Richardson at the time, was that the absence of U.S. ambassadors in the region was a big problem because there wasn't somebody that leaders of these countries could talk to, knowing that they were a representative of the United States president. And how important, maybe I'll start with you, Dr. Myers, how important is it for us to have representation there in these countries of the President of the United States in the form of a U.S. ambassador?
Thank you very much. No, it's absolutely of paramount importance, both symbolically, as we aim to demonstrate our commitment to engagement with these countries, with our partners in the region, but also operationally, as you've noted. If there's nobody to talk to, if there's nobody to express concerns to, if there's nobody to negotiate with, then these countries are at a loss, and our partnerships and our bilateral relations suffer. So critically important to get people in place, and if we do not, then this provides an opportunity for others to step into the fold, and to do so during those periods where truly our leadership is absent.
Yeah, it seems like if the Chinese and the Russians have high-level representatives there in the region and we don't, that sounds like a sort of a self-inflicted wound. I still remember when General Kelly was head of Southern Command years ago, talk about the counter-drug issue. And of course, a lot of the drugs don't just start in Mexico. They end up there and then are brought in the United States. And obviously, Colombia's role in the cocaine trade is well known. But I still remember General Kelly, when he was head of Southern Command, said as a result of the lack of assets for the United States military and the counter-drug mission, that they only were able to interdict about 17%, I think is the number that sticks in my mind, of the drugs that make their way from South America through Central America through Mexico into the United States. And of course, I think it's entirely appropriate that Senator Shaheen has these maps from the Armed Services Committee. Obviously, the American military has to cover a lot of territory, but how important is it for the United States government in the form of the U.S. Military Southern Command to provide assets there to interdict the drugs that make their way from South America, Central America, and Mexico and into the United States?
Thank you, Senator. That's an excellent point. I think it's incredibly important and vital that the Defense Department work with our partner countries in Latin America to interdict drugs. And I encourage a deployment of all available assets, sharing intelligence, giving capabilities. Many of these efforts need to be host country led, and we've seen the most successful ones led by the countries themselves, but the United States should be there to provide guidance and the capabilities and the intelligence to do so, and if the assets if necessary.
Thank you. And that's an appropriate point, particularly when it comes to drugs. You know, there's so much money involved in the drug trade that the corruption is staggering in places where they do produce a lot of drugs, and sometimes it's very difficult for the people who are trying to do the right thing because of that. Senator Keene, you know a little bit about Latin America. Would you care to share with us?
Thank you. Well, I'm really happy to be here with the witnesses, and just a thought about the Monroe Doctrine. One of the things we need to be a little bit careful of is, in Latin America, the Monroe Doctrine is viewed as the U.S. wasn't really interested in Latin America, it was interested in Europe. And it was a doctrine, we're going to keep Europe out, not you're important, it was we're going to keep Europe out. And sometimes I think that Latin American countries believe that U.S. pays attention when others are interested, like China or Russia, but we're not paying attention because we value the relationships. And so, and I think any new doctrine is one that certainly we ought to be worrying about this, but we also need to be communicating the message that we value the relationship, and that should be first. And we do need more attention. I'm worried about the USAID cuts. I'm worried about Secretary Hegseth gave a directive to departments in the Pentagon to develop a cut plan, and then he exempted certain parts of the Pentagon from the cut plan, but not Southcom. Southcom always complains about not having enough resources. We'll see what the cut plan actually is, but if Southcom's resources are degraded further, that's a problem. And then the other thing I'm concerned about is the administration has announced, not with respect to the Americas, but more generally, a desire to shrink the number of consular offices around the world. So if there begins to be less of a presence in Latin America or elsewhere, that could have a challenge. So I hope we can work on those. Let me tell you, from really loving this area and having lived there, 3 challenges that I see, and I may ask you to pick any of them and address them and give us some advice. Number one, in the Americas, I think China sometimes gets more credit than they really deserve for this reason. China will come with a pretty big checkbook, and a Chinese company is viewed as part of the Chinese government. So they got a big checkbook. The U.S. government comes with a small checkbook, but then U.S. businesses are all over Latin America with a big checkbook, but the U.S. government does not get credit for the U.S. investment. That's kind of happening, because of free markets, et cetera. So when you hear Latin American leaders say, well, China's got a lot on the table. What about you guys? What do you have on the table? They're giving us credit for the U.S. government check. They're not really considering the total investment. So I think one challenge we have is figuring out a way through financing tools and others to really help message that, hey, we are more present than China if you consider whole of society and measure that against whole of Chinese society, we're more present. We're not getting credit for the private sector investment. I'm really thrilled about this BlackRock investment that Senator Cornyn discussed. Second, here's another problem in the Americas. We pay attention to the trouble spots and not the successes. And of course, we ought to pay attention to the trouble spots, Nicaragua, Cuba, Venezuela. But when you've got, Uruguay doing some things well, Panama doing some things well, Paraguay, Costa Rica, Dominican Republic, Chile, Colombia, military to military, very strong, even though we've got some challenges on the civilian side, we're more paying attention to the headaches and we're not paying attention to the success stories. And some of the successful nations are like, hey, we'd be better off being your adversary. You'd pay more attention to us. Our humanitarian aid, once nations get to sort of a middle income place, the tools of USAID, even if we turn on the funds, they don't get them. They can get a security deal, but not development assistance. China's not stopping development assistance to nations when they get to be middle income. They're like, we're glad to be there. So I think the way, if we're worried about Latin American like democracy and success, the best thing is to help the successful nations even be more successful, because then their next door neighbors will look at them and say, yeah, we want to be more like that. So us lecturing them about how to be successful is not going to be near as successful as seeing a successful neighbor next door. We ought to figure out ways to take the nations that are doing things right and give them more resources and attention. And then the third thing, and I blame myself for this, I'm very guilty of this. We talk about the Americas. We don't do enough in the Caribbean. And then we end up with all these Caribbean nations voting against us in the UN on all kinds of things. Because when we think about the Americas, I know I'm always thinking about Central America and South America, and I put that on myself. We need to broaden the aperture a little bit to maybe invest more in the Caribbean, and they're very hungry for us to put more attention in. So address either of those. How can we get more credit for what we do society-wide? How can we pay more attention to the successes than the headaches? And what should we be doing more in the Caribbean? If you could each pick one of those and give a quick answer.
I'll begin. Excellent points. Maybe I can touch on all three. I think what you're really hinting at is what has to be included in the strategy that will be due in June is a public diplomacy component to message the success cases while also combating democratic backsliding and so forth, but to put the message across of the points that you've hit on. And I very much agree about the Caribbean. And as I pointed out in my opening statement, the crisis in Haiti is the looming crisis that's going to challenge the United States that we're not paying enough attention to in the Western Hemisphere. If Haiti completely collapses as a country of 12 to 13 million people, where do you think they're headed? That creates a humanitarian catastrophe. The Dominican Republic, next door, another nation of 12 to 13 million people, will be on the verge of collapse. And sticking with the Dominican Republic, great success case. We should strengthen our strategic partnership with the Dominican Republic across all sectors. They're hungry for it. There's been a lot of progress made on that front with Secretary Rubio's recent trip. In fact, they're asking us and inviting us to help them develop their critical minerals, rare earth industry. This is a nation that's projected to have 5% GDP growth.
Might I have Ms. Myers just say something really quick, Mr. Chair? Thank you. Please, Ms. Myers.
Apologies. No, I would love to, first of all, I agree wholeheartedly on all of these points. They're absolutely fundamental, especially the conceptualization of the Monroe Doctrine and how that's problematic, and how, we have to ensure that our Latin America policy doesn't come across as a China policy or as a Russia policy or any other form of alignment with our adversaries. On the issue of, China getting more credit than it deserves. This is, to me, largely a messaging issue, right? China comes to the table with big numbers. Many of those numbers are not met, right? It comes to the table with a lot of promises. A lot of those promises don't come to pass. I'm thinking about the lithium sector right now, where there have been promises to build factories to build lithium batteries all over Argentina and elsewhere. None of that's happened. None of that. There's no intention for that to happen, right? So making that clear, demonstrating that those promises indeed are unlikely to come to pass, I think is absolutely fundamental, while also working on our own communication strategy. We do so much in the region. We have historically. We don't toot our own horn enough, right? Often. There are obviously, ways to do this that are some are more effective than others, depends on the context, depends on the country. But we need to think very critically about the types of projects we're pursuing through development assistance, right? And how best to amplify the gains and communicate the value of those, both here, domestically to justify their continuation, but also overseas.
Thank you. I'll yield back, Mr. Chair. He always says, you have nothing to yield back, Kane. You've gone way over your time. He said that to me yesterday.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and Ranking Member Shaheen for calling this hearing, and thank you to our distinguished guest. Over the past 4 years, communities in Pennsylvania, my home state, and across the country have firsthand experienced the consequences of a vacuum, a lack of leadership in Latin America, and the trafficking of fentanyl and other illicit drugs in particular, and the flow of illegal immigrants from around the world across the southern border have affected the entire region. The Mexican drug cartels and the other transnational criminal organizations rake in massive profits, as the chairman have said, in a variety of ways. To make matters worse, as has been discussed, the Chinese Communist Party has stepped into that vacuum left by uninterested leaders in Washington to expand its activity and influence in Latin America. And for Beijing, the calculation's simple: gain access to resources and critical infrastructure to support the CCP's global ambitions while undermining the influence and economic priorities of the United States in its own backyard. This cannot continue, and that's why I'm so glad that Secretary Rubio and the Trump administration have focused on these challenges. With that backdrop, Ms. Myers, I'd like to start with you. Mexico is both the third largest recipient of Chinese investment in Latin America and the largest trading partner of the United States. And I'm particularly concerned about the investment by China in strategic industries, important sectors in Mexico that could undermine our national security and, for that matter, their national security. What's your assessment of how the new Mexican government is addressing these concerns? In the United States, we, of course, have CFIUS as the process. What are the Mexican officials, what's the Mexican government doing to address this?
Thank you. It's a critical question. My assessment is that, for a number of years now, there has been a concerted effort on the part of Chinese officials to engage far more extensively with Mexico, to build ties, to strengthen partnerships, to upgrade the overall relationship, to be able to achieve various aims in strategic sectors. This has worked to some degree, right? There has been movement. There have been new deals struck, including in critical minerals, for example, and critical infrastructure, as you've mentioned. And we've seen, as we've seen elsewhere in the region, a real effort on localization, right? China is not just engaging with presidents, it's not just engaging with heads of state, it's engaging at the state level, at the municipal level, with tiny towns in certain cases, if there are projects of strategic interest there. And so much is happening in Jalisco, it's happening in Mexican states. And so, the challenge is a bit bigger when you are dealing with different administrative levels and having to manage that and account for it. What I do see now, though, is a real effort to respond to U.S. concerns about the extent of Chinese involvement, the extent of Chinese investment, using the USMCA as a backdoor potentially to ship goods to the United States that would otherwise be subject to tariffs, and we'll see how far that goes, but there does seem to me a willingness to at least sit down and have these discussions, and an openness to investment review mechanisms of some form, even if they don't look exactly like CFIUS.
Great, thank you. Dr. Ledford, I was very happy to see Secretary Rubio designate the cartels as terrorist organizations, and of course, as you know, that unlocks a whole new set of authorities and possibilities for how the United States can engage on the security threat, national security threat. Now what? How would you suggest, what's the framework for how the United States military, border patrol, national security infrastructure should engage with the Mexican government in pursuit of addressing the cartels, particularly given what the chairman mentioned about the deep-seated corruption that exists within Mexico and the cartels?
Thank you for the question, Senator. I think this is the million-dollar question, is how do we have a long-term, stable and prosperous Mexico that's free and secure? It's going to be on the Mexican authorities' side to decide how deep the engagement goes with the United States. We have the tools and the resources and the volition. We need to renegotiate our security framework with Mexico, and I've been heartened by the recent moves by the President of Mexico to deploy more guards to the border, turn over cartel members, but we need new legal authorities to deepen security cooperation on intelligence, on providing equipment, but it has to be Mexican-led, and this has always been the issue, I think less on our side and more on the Mexican government side, and it's my understanding, the administration is engaged in these kind of conversations, and it's part of the tense negotiations that are bound up in tariffs and so forth. But I'm optimistic that we can develop a new framework. As far as the FTO designation goes, I think one positive aspect of that will be reducing the flow of illicit arms southbound, because now if someone sells arms to someone associated with an organization that's designated under the FTO, they'll be prosecuted for it under federal guidelines.
That's a good point. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and to our ranking member for holding this important hearing. I am really grateful for the two colleagues to be here, but I want to, Dr. Ledford, I'm really excited that you're here, not just because of your great haircut, but also because you're from the Hoover Institution. And I was a Stanford student, Stanford graduate student, took classes over there. Larry Diamond was one of the more influential people in my early life taking his classes. I think his last book, I wish it could make it handed out to everybody. The title alone is pretty cutting. Ill Winds, I think it was, countering Russia's rage, China's, I think, opportunism. But then he talks a lot about American complacency, and that this erosion of the global democracy is a failure in many ways for us to counter Russian Chinese influence. And these charts, in so many ways, really speak to that. And I just really worry. I've traveled around the world and have seen how when we step up, I was in East Africa and seeing how it was American State Department programs that really created a better environment for U.S. business investment. And I saw some extraordinary partnerships between American investors and East African leaders that transformed entire communities, literally millions of them, bringing stability, rising people out of poverty, whether it was the agricultural input, the marketing of those products, the bringing them overseas in trade relationships. Without that, though, and very candidly, people would tell me in that context, you create this environment for chaos, for terrorism, or for Chinese opportunism. And so as we look at this hemisphere, I'm just wondering, I don't know your relationship with my professor who gave me an A-. You can tell him I'm still upset about that, in his extraordinary class. But do you agree with him that there is an urgent role for the use, as he would call it, the reduction of our using of soft power, not just military power, but really the soft power necessary to counter China?
Thank you, Senator. Glad to be here all the way from the farm. I'll tell Larry you said hello.
Please.
Yes, I very much agree with Professor Diamond, the exercise of soft power, and that can be done through the State Department. And it's to a point that others have raised and that I've raised myself about constant engagement, that we have to have both high-level engagement and mid-level engagement. Ambassadors are on the ground, secretaries there, but the institutions that you've talked about to further that kind of engagement. So I'm in agreement, don't have much more to add on that.
And let me double down there then. So I remember when Secretary Mattis sat before us and said, if you make cuts to the State Department, buy me more bullets. And when I see us now cutting programs, some of which I've visited and other of my colleagues have visited, that provide some basic health care and stability, and then we decide to do the far more expensive intervention when it comes to suddenly mass migration coming out of these unstable countries. If you were just an investor, forget advising senators, but if you were like a business investor, it seems much more wise to invest on a lot of the root causes of this global crisis of migration than to be responding to the cartels that opportunistically exploit people, the drugs that are related to that and more. Am I correct?
Yes, Senator. We always have to pair any sort of security measures with long-term development to address, as you say, the root cause strategy. Of course, the success rate is on a long-term horizon. We don't see those results as quick as we do as aggressive efforts on the law enforcement side. But we have to pair those together, because you're not going to have security without development.
I'm so grateful you said that. And the last thing I'd really want to address, and I was so grateful to my colleague for bringing up the importance of expanding the aperture to the Caribbean. And Haiti is one of these crises that is, and I know the sort of faith traditions of a lot of my colleagues here, the moral urgency alone. But should we not be engaged in stability there, in trying to bring about some kind of restoration of governance or dealing with the humanitarian crisis, the consequences for our country seem to be dire. To ignore it, to pull back from using U.S. soft power and the strength of our nation, it seems to come with consequences. Would you agree with that?
Yes, dire consequences. The United States has to take a leadership role to bring democracy and order to Haiti.
I really appreciate it, and thank you very much. Please tell Professor Diamond he really shaped my view of the world, and I'm privileged that I'm in a position now that I could use the wisdom and all the good things he taught me when I was a student there. Thank you.
Thank you, Senator. Senator?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you both. And I want to follow up a little bit on Senator Booker's question regarding soft power, but also direct assistance in the form of foreign assistance. As Senator Shaheen mentioned at the outset of this hearing, we did get a step forward in terms of a court order. The Supreme Court 5-4 ordered that AID and others pay funds already due and owing under contracts, which seems pretty straightforward. The U.S. government should make good on its obligations that have already been incurred. But the outstanding question, of course, remains the freeze on other foreign assistance, whether it's AID funds or other forms of foreign assistance, military security assistance. So, Ms. Myers, would you agree that by stopping this assistance, we not only don't provide important help to our friends in Latin America, but we open the door even wider to China and other adversaries?
I couldn't agree more. Certainly, I mean, not only is this detrimental to us as to our partnerships, to our relations with the region, to trust in the United States to fulfill its obligations and to support, hemispheric affairs, which it is for so many years committed to do. But we have, on the other hand, a China that is coming to the region with a very comprehensive Belt and Road strategy underway, which has continued for upwards of a decade now, and which contains, at this point, and I would say over the past 3 or 4 years, an expansion of activity in the people-to-people space, in diplomatic activity, in technical cooperation, military assistance, in all of these areas that we have been really dominant in for so many years. So taking a step back now is essentially akin to shooting ourselves in the foot. Mm-hmm.
I agree, and Dr. Leffert, I've been listening in terms of the points you've been making. I agree entirely. We need a comprehensive strategy here. We need an economic strategy engaging with the private sector. We sort of need to approach this from all angles to both, make sure that our interests are served, that our values are advanced, and that we do our best to keep our adversaries from further advancing in the region. And so as part of that, would you agree that the foreign assistance that we've provided has been a useful tool among many in terms of advancing our interests?
Thank you, Senator. Yes, I agree that foreign assistance aligned with the aims, the political aims, and the values of our country is an effective tool amongst other tools in bringing a comprehensive framework to bear on hemispheric security and prosperity.
Now, I appreciate that, and of course it is one tool, but I believe it's a very important tool, and it's especially dangerous when we're seen to be retreating or forfeiting one of our many tools. So, and I was here at the beginning when Senator Shaheen, pointed out these maps, and I apologize if this has been covered, but in which countries in Latin America do you believe that China has gained the most leverage and the most influence through its efforts? And if I just start with you, Ms. Myers.
You know, if I were asked that 5 years ago, I would have a different answer than today. But at this juncture, China has considerable leverage across the entirety of the region in some form or another. There are some countries, and I would say particularly South American countries, where China has, expansive trade relations that underpin the dynamic and which ensure some degree of dependence and therefore, a more overall influence. Also, those countries that are smaller and have received infusions of capital from China that make essentially an outsized contribution to the overall economic development tend to also align more closely with China on wide-ranging issues.
Thank you. Dr. Ledford.
I concur with my brilliant co-panelists, but I just want to highlight the gains made in Peru. It's not just the megaport, which will fundamentally change trade routes between China and Latin America, but they own the electrical grids, business, potential corruption. So we want to look at, in terms of Chinese influence, particular choke points in Latin America, but again, it's across the entire region.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Senator Scott.
Thank you, Chairman. Thanks for being here. How much do you think we've spent in foreign aid in Central and South America in the last 10 years? Do you guys have any idea?
In totality, I'll just take a stab in the dark. Maybe 20 billion. I think 2.2 billion was authorized for fiscal year 2025.
Okay. Do you think that's what the number is?
I don't have the numbers, Senator. Apologies.
Okay. So, let's say it's $20 billion. So if I went to the taxpayers back in my state and said, this is what you got for $20 billion, what would you say we got? What would a Florida taxpayer say we got out of that $20 billion expenditures?
You might have
If I had to guess, I would say that they would probably say not enough.
Now, what would be something concrete that we could say that we got out of if I went back to talk to taxpayers and they'd say, so with that $20 billion, this is what we got.
We fund law enforcement measures in Mexico. Now, given they're not as productive as we would like them to be, we've given millions recently to support the multilateral security support mission in Haiti to prevent the collapse of the country. So in terms of the security measures, we do support anti-narcotic efforts.
What would you say that if I have to go back to a taxpayer and tell them I got a return somehow, what would you say I got?
I mean, obviously, some of these taxpayers may be looking for, immediate solutions to the problems that they are witnessing and encountering. The challenge is that a lot of this is medium to long term in nature, right? It's an effort to work over time with our partners to address issues that are enormously complex and require multifaceted solutions. That is hard to explain to a taxpayer, but I mean, truly, across the board, it's health, it's education, it's addressing the root causes of migration to, over time, reduce overall flows of irregular migration to the United States. It's addressing insecurity, it's building ties, it's building trust, it's building...
Let's go through that for a second. So I went back to Florida and say, I just spent $20 billion of your money, and we prevented drugs from coming in. They say, wait a minute. 78,000 people died of fentanyl last year. They'd say, you haven't been very successful. They'd say, we are worried about crime in our country, and you're paying for police in another country when we don't have enough police on the streets in our country. And in 2023, something like 1 out of every 43 Americans was subject to a violent crime. They'd say, we've got, you spend money, you say, on health care. They say, we have people in our country that don't have enough health. I mean, our food, all these things. I mean, I've been up here 6 years. This is the busiest time since I've been up here. Everybody in my office is asking for money, and here's what my pitch to them. I said, I just went through a campaign. There's not one person, almost in every issue that people are talking about, they're worried about cutting spending, that one Floridian brought up that we got to make sure we do that. There's not one. My problem is I can't go I can't go back to Florida and say, boy, I'm excited about how much money we spent on foreign aid because I got something good happen. Let's see. Castro regime still controls Cuba. Venezuela just stole another election. Ortega's getting stronger in Nicaragua. Petro's a terrorist, name it. Lula's trying to destroy Brazil. Right? I don't know, did we help Malay get elected? I don't think so. We got it. Yeah, so I look at it and say, so short-term, long-term, 20 years, I can't see what we did in Latin America that we spent, if we spent $20 billion that we got to return. And that's what I have to do. I have to go home and say, here's how your tax dollars are going to get spent. What would you be your, thinking how, if you think that way, if you like a citizen that thinks their taxes are too high, what do you say to them?
Again, I think, this is there's not a country that doesn't struggle with this to some degree. These debates are ongoing everywhere, including in China, right? Where they say, what is this Belt and Road Initiative about? Stop spending our money on it and do something at home, right? This is the problem that many countries are experiencing. Nevertheless, most have conceded that foreign aid achieves wide-ranging objectives. Strategic, security-related, health and safety related, really you name it, and in terms of building our partnerships with the region if we believe that there's strength in numbers, right? A lot of this is intangible, a lot of this is, again, medium to long term, and so it is very difficult to explain to an electorate. But, I think we need to determine whether we believe that this is the right course of action ourselves, right? And then make the effort to come up with narratives that do demonstrate the value over time of these commitments. And I'm sure I'm not particularly equipped to offer concrete, evidence at this particular moment, but I'm sure that the many institutions that do these things have, countless examples of the ways in which they've impacted the region positively and U.S. citizens positively, directly, as a result. I wish I had something more concrete to offer in the way of messaging.
I hate to cut off this debate because this is a really, really important debate. Unfortunately, we're in the process of voting. They're going to call all of us down there in a minute. And Senator Curtis, I want to give you a shot at this, please.
Thank you. I'll be careful with my time. I would like to note, thank you for doing this hearing. I'd like to note that it's my honor to replace Secretary Rubio as the Western Hemisphere Subcommittee Chair, and really look forward to delving in on some of these issues and working with the Secretary on these. I'd like to know, in your view, the primary strategic goals of both Russia and China in the Western Hemisphere, how those goals differ between the two, and how can the United States better position ourselves to counterbalance those goals? Go ahead.
I'm happy to begin. It's my view that China's goals in the region are largely the same as they were around the 1990s during this moment of the going out strategy, right? Wherein China was seeking resources, it was seeking markets for its products, and it was seeking to internationalize its companies to make them more competitive, right? We're seeing the same dynamic at play now. Resources are absolutely fundamental. Markets are more important than ever as China looks to export its excess capacity, especially in high-tech goods, which is fundamental to its economic growth. It's an existential challenge for China at the moment. And we continue to see efforts to try to ensure that Chinese companies are not only competitive, but dominant across certain strategic sectors, including in the high-tech space. This is something that China is looking to pursue in Latin America and has pursued for many, many years. In addition to this, of course, are other interests that facilitate these objectives. Reducing U.S. influence, U.S. ability to engage, creates an environment in which China is able to pursue its objectives more extensively, more easily. And so wide-ranging communications, campaigns, people-to-people contacts, other forms of engagement have sought to do that and have done so very effectively in certain instances. So China, I mean, I still see China's engagement as largely economic in nature, but obviously with a political component to it and a strategic component to it, in that all of these things are dramatically interrelated. For Russia, my sense, and I don't follow Russia as carefully as China, is that this is much more directed at undermining U.S. influence, U.S. interests at all junctures, right? With or without an economic interest, accompanying that. And we see that across the board in terms of the ways that Russia pursues certain deals, the types of agreements that it's striking, the folks that it engages with in the Latin American context. China engages with everyone, as we mentioned earlier. Russia really is very targeted in its engagements in an effort to undermine U.S. interests across the board.
Thank you. Doctor, if you can give me the short version so I can try to squeeze another question, and thank you.
I would just like to add Iran. I think we haven't focused enough on the Ayatollah. Iran has deepened its engagement to undermine the U.S. specifically, and also its proxy Hezbollah, which operates in the tri-border region to the tune of about $300 to $400 million a year to fund its terrorist activities in the Middle East. So it is very much about undermining the U.S. in its own hemisphere.
Thank you both. Let me shift to a similar topic. Several Latin American and Caribbean nations have recently shifted, considering their diplomatic recognition from Taiwan to the People's Republic of China. Can you both just briefly touch on how the U.S. can reward those who are more aligned with our position? What opportunities, diplomatic or otherwise, do we have to strengthen our friend Taiwan? Doctor, why don't you start?
Yes, I think we should reward our allies in the region that continue to recognize Taiwan with closer engagement and the benefits that come with being a close strategic partner with the United States, and to continue to encourage their engagement with Taiwan and dissuade them from giving in to PRC influence to de-recognize Taiwan.
And if I could add to that, in addition to continuing to work with them in substantive ways, offering assistance in the areas that they are prioritizing from a developmental perspective, it will be critical also for us to communicate sort of the lack of progress that some of those countries that have made this recent decision to cut ties with Taiwan have had with China, right? There's not a lot happening, or at least certainly what's happening is not what was anticipated. And so, that's a critical message for us to convey as well. It's not necessarily that you're going to get everything you want from China once you play this critical economic and diplomatic card.
Thank you. I'm out of time, and I won't push us. I have a lot of questions, and hopefully we can have a continued dialogue. Thank you very much. I yield my time.
The record's going to stay open until close of business tomorrow, so if you want to submit some questions for the record, I'm sure.
We certainly will. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
A sincere thank you to our witnesses on behalf of both Senator Shaheen and I. This has been a very enlightening discussion. I think a lot more talk about problems than solutions, but possible solutions. This is an area that USG has got to spend more time on. We just really do. If you're not there, you can't play in the game. And so Senator Shaheen and I are committed to getting ambassadors there where we don't have ambassadors. That's critical. We had a good hearing yesterday with 3 of the people that are going to the State Department. All 3 of them were committed to the proposition that we talked about today, and that is how important economic engagement is to your relationship with the country. And they are all committed to see that USG is there at the table if necessary with U.S. companies to try to make things happen down there. So a sincere thank you to both of you for attending today and providing us with the benefit of your testimony. For the information of members, the record will remain open until the close of business tomorrow. We'd ask the witnesses to respond to those questions as rapidly as possible. And again, with thanks to the committee, this committee is now adjourned.